One of the most critical components to any application is the data. And when you're working with Azure, a common place to store data is within Azure Storage. So let's take a look at some of the replication scenarios supported in Azure Storage that'll give you high availability. So the first thing I want to do here in the portal is head over to storage accounts. And I want to show you this process here. We'll create a storage account. And as we're kind of going through and specifying the name of the storage account, the location, and some of the different preferences here, you'll notice we've got the replication options. Now you can see here that it defaults to read access geo-redundant storage, and we'll talk about what that is, but obviously by the name we can infer that we're going to have geographic redundancy for the data if we pick this default setting. But hitting the drop-down, we have different types. We've got locally redundant storage, we've got zone redundant storage, geo-redundant storage, and then read access geo-redundant storage. So what we want to do in this video is understand the difference between these different replication types, and of course, depending on what you pick here, that's going to also determine your costs. But let's talk about this because it is going to also drive your high availability design. So let's talk about this first one on the list here, locally redundant storage. If you take a look in the Azure documentation, they go into great detail here about these different replication types. Locally redundant storage gives you 11 nines of availability, like they talk about here in this first paragraph in the documentation. And one of the key considerations here is you can see in this first paragraph, it talks about basically you're getting 3 copies of the data when you're using locally redundant storage. So you're getting 3 copies of the data within a single data center, essentially. So they're in different fault domains in a single Azure availability zone in a single region. Now here in the second paragraph, you can see that a storage scale unit is a collection of racks of storage nodes, and a fault domain is a group of nodes that represent a physical unit of failure. So if you remember back to when we talked about availability sets, the idea here with locally redundant storage is it's kind of like you're getting an availability set with 3 copies of your data. You've got 3 copies in 3 different fault domains. And so if a server rack fails, you've still got multiple copies of your data. However, it's the least amount of data redundancy because if you lose the region in the data center or the availability zone where your data is stored in this storage scale unit, then the application goes down or the data is inaccessible. So for highly available application designs, locally redundant storage is probably not going to give you the most robust set of features and functionality because you're only storing data in one physical location. Now moving on kind of to the second option here, zone redundant storage. This is a new replication option in Azure Storage or a newer replication option in Azure Storage because it does support availability zones. So as you can see in this first paragraph here in the documentation, they say that zone redundant storage or ZRS-based replication replicates your data synchronously across 3 storage clusters in a single region, but it's doing that across availability zones. So each storage cluster is physically separated from the others, and it resides in its own availability zone. So obviously this is going to give you much more availability and durability in your data. And if you look further down the documentations, they're giving you 12 nines of availability here because we've got the data located in multiple availability zones throughout a single region. Now, finally, you might be building applications that are going to be highly available and utilizing multiple Azure regions. And that's when some of the geo-redundancy and read access type of scenarios give you some more protection here. So the big difference between GRS and RAGRS is discussed here in this article. You can see that they say that GRS or geo-redundant storage replicates your data to another data center in a secondary region, but you can only read that data if Microsoft initiates a failover from your primary region to the secondary. So with geo-redundant storage, it's basically like an insurance policy. You're getting a copy of your data in another region somewhere, but it's up to Microsoft to give you access to that data in the event of some kind of regional outage. Now, if you go with this other option here, read access geo-redundant storage or RAGRS, that's going to replicate your data to a secondary region, again, just like the first option, but you're going to have the ability to read data out of that secondary endpoint whenever you want to. And so you can do this regardless of whether or not Microsoft initiates a failover from the primary to the secondary region. And so really that's why RAGRS is the default option when you come in here to create a storage account, because that's the most highly available model that gives you the most durability, availability, and access to your data in multiple regions. So the big takeaway here is that for highly available architectures, they're going to span multiple regions. You're going to want to go with the read access geo-redundant storage. And coming up in the next video, let's take a look at how we would actually access and get to that read-only data in another region when we have this all set up.